And we have this afternoon John Morgan from Lost River Winery. And Mr. Morgan, you know about him. I've already sent you links and stuff, so I'm not going to get between you and him. He will talk to us about winemaking, both the art and the entrepreneurship end of it, and the business end of it, the science of it, everything. And then I hope you have questions. John will speak to us for a little bit, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. And I will get out from between you and him. Thank you. John, welcome.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much, Rajib. Thank you all also for coming. It's really an honor to come speak to you. I'm an alumnus of the UW, class of '83. I graduated in forestry, kind of a hybrid degree. I'm going to sit down. You guys are okay with that? This is, it's kind of a hybrid of civil engineering and forestry, as I spent a first career in public works construction. About the end of the 1990s, built mostly roads and bridges. And about the end of the 1990s, the spring Chinook were listed as endangered. And we went from building bridges, was pretty much exclusively what I did at that point, on a one-year cycle from design and buying right of way and building the things and wrapping them up, to pretty much immediately 2 years, and then within about a year it was a 3-year sort of horizon for doing that work. And just kind of had to decide whether that was something I wanted to do for another 20 or 25 years. And something I think is more common these days. When I was starting out, everybody was still sort of in the mindset of you're going to go to work for a company or in a career and stick that way. And I think you guys are probably much more used to thinking about the idea of doing different things over your life, maybe reinventing yourselves. So I was really kind of in a mindset of wondering if I wanted to make a change. I happened to take a trip down to the Central California camping and snorkeling trip, and got to see some of the people in the production side of winemaking, which to me was not really what wine was to me. Wine was kind of hoity-toity and just snobbish, I guess, a little bit. I mean, it was part of my culture. My dad was a wine fancier, and it was part of our Sunday evening meals, and something I was familiar with and something I enjoyed. But it wasn't something I ever really envisioned myself doing. And meeting a lot of these people they were sort of like farmers and contractors, and they just seemed like regular people who enjoyed what they were doing. And I kind of caught the bug. It was a bit of an epiphany for me, and I came back with an idea of what I wanted to do pretty solidly, and I kind of set about trying to make that happen. And I just sort of immediately started out making a sort of a batch of homebrew on steroids. I'd made homemade wine before, but I sort of wanted to be able to go out and do research and gain some education and see if I could really do this on a commercial scale. And so I went from making wine in glass jugs or carboys to making wine in barrels, which takes quite a bit of fruit. To fill a standard barrel of wine takes about half a ton of grapes to fill it up and keep it full. And it's a little bit of a nerve-wracking process, but along with some really good distance learning courses through UC Davis, I felt I had some of the resources and confidence to try that, and it was pretty successful. So within about a year of that, about 2001, I just made the break and tendered my resignation, and we moved to where our summer home was at that time, where our home is now, which is in the town of Mazama. It's about 20 miles west of Winthrop, and on the east side of the North Cascades Highway. Those of you who know the state, you know that that's not really grape country. One of the hard and fast problems in the grape industry is extreme winter cold, damage to vines. That Mazama and Winthrop share the record cold temperature for the state at 48 below zero. and it's quite cold. We tend to get 10 below zero about every year, and that's kind of a magic number for being able to sustain grape plants. That's the point at which they become irreparably damaged for the succeeding season. And if you get down as low as 20 below zero, and we're not talking about for long periods of time, even a night or two, you can have structural damage to the vines as well. So it's really not a place where you can grow grapes. So why there? You know, more particularly, why here? Why Woodinville? You know, why is that this one of the centers of the Washington wine industry? This is something that a lot of tourists that come to visit us really find odd, that we have a grape and wine industry that is really so kind of separated from the vineyards. And this goes back really to the beginnings of way back in the mists of time. I'm looking to see how old you guys are. Probably are the mists of time for most of you, but only about 40 years ago is really the inception of maybe 45 years ago now is really the inception of the Washington wine industry. So it's a very young industry. And people can talk to you all they want about how, there's a tradition of, people bringing Italian varieties and the Walla Walla and grandpa this and grandma that. And, don't let them kid you. Really, we didn't really have a pre-prohibition wine industry at all in Washington the way they did in California. That was sort of an immigrant-founded industry in the 19th century. Our industry very much occurred after the war, after Prohibition, and for its first several decades, this is really an interesting example of protectionism and how protectionism can really be not so much disastrous for an industry, but when you remove protectionism, how stimulating that can be. We had a system in Washington where it was illegal to import wine from elsewhere. Okay, and this is at a time when Washington wasn't a world-class wine-producing place. Okay, so what kind of wine did we have here? Well, we had a company called Nawico that later became ultimately San Michel Wine Estates, but was a company that made some Concord grape wine. They essentially had a lock on the Washington wine market because of this protectionist system, and they literally made wine from apple peels, okay, from offal, byproducts of the fruit packing industry. You can imagine, people drinking wine made from from apple peels, and it's probably, I had no idea what it tasted like. I imagine it was flavored and something like Mike's Hard Lemonade, or which is a grain beverage, so you don't really taste, doesn't really taste like beer. But I mean, who knows what this is? It has to have been nasty, and I don't think America was really regarded as a great wine producing area back in the 40s and 50s. So in the 1960s, a guy by the name of Sid Abrams, who was a lobbyist for the California Wine Institute, introduced and passed a law called the California Wine Act that opened up Washington to out-of-state wines. Everybody thought this was going to be the death of this not really very important but somewhat successful wine industry, I guess, protected wine industry. And what resulted from that was that we got our wine industry. Nawico bought a piece of land out here in Woodinville, the Stimson Estate, and became a company called Stimson Lane. It was owned even before then by U.S. Tobacco, USST, the people that make Skoal, and you hear me okay back there? Skoal and Copenhagen. And they planted a lot of vineyards down on the Horsehaven Hills, and ultimately opened a winery called San Michel Winery, built on a French chateau model here in Woodinville. They wanted to build the winery where the people were. They brought the grapes in those days by train from eastern Washington. About the same time, another early, really important Washington winery, Associated Vintners, started, notably by UW professors. And ultimately became Columbia Winery, which is not as big a player anymore, but was a big player back then. So that was really the inception of our wine industry, and kind of came from there. So we chose to locate in Mazama because we could, and people sort of accept the notion that you can build your winery where you want, whether that's on Vashon Island like Andrew Will, or in the Walla Walla Valley where a lot of the early important wineries were that when no one was growing grapes there. And moved over and started to build the winery, which kind of gets me to the core of what I think some of your interests are, which is how do you do that, and how do you actualize a business like that when you really don't even have a background in it, which was interesting. So what do you do? The first question, sort of is that I think will come up is, how am I going to pay for this? And I think this, when I'm talking about the wine industry, I think you can probably apply this to a lot of entrepreneurial things. What would you like to do? You get a crazy idea, and is it workable? I think you're going to face a lot of the same questions. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that there are elements of manufacturing and there's elements of marketing and all of that plays into it. So it touches on a lot of different things. I think, is it Dr. or Rajib has picked a good example in a lot of ways. There's a lot to the industry that can be illustrative. So the first question is, how are you going to pay for this? In my case, I had the benefit of having some independent means. In the late 1980s, my brother and my sister and I kind of carried on what's been a 3-generation, now going into the 4th-generation family business for me in commercial real estate. My grandmother passed away and left us a little bit of money, and we bought an income property with it. We've been very, very successful with that. And so I kind of had the ability to sort of to do a lot of this, capitalize a lot of this with my own resources. But I can share the experiences that a lot of my friends have had, and I've seen a lot of people go through this. And there are a lot of people that, whether they have means or not, have a passion for the industry, and a big part of realizing that passion is kind of doing it all, building the thing. I think it's probably not a terribly easy thing to sell a winery, because people really want to, that have the means to buy a winery, kind of want to develop their own identity, develop their own brand, develop their own dream. But I have had a lot of friends who frankly have day jobs, and many of whom still have day jobs, a decade or more into doing it. And are, some people put their 401ks into the project. Some people put every dime they've got into the project. A lot of people will actually work in the industry, which I think is beneficial, because you learn a lot about the industry as well. I have a number of friends who have sort of written into their employment contracts that they want to have space in the facility, use of the equipment. Sometimes fruit, if it's a vineyard operation as well, as part of their compensation. So they'll work a little cheaper and take part of their income in equity and sweat equity, and develop a brand that way. Sort of again, there's a fair amount of sort of ego and personality that goes into the industry. I think your hypothetical winemaker, if I remembered, had a sugar daddy, I guess, someone that was a billionaire, high-tech billionaire, something that always wanted to be in the wine industry. That's not really very hypothetical. There are a ton of people out there who always wanted to be in the wine industry. There's NFL quarterbacks, there's people that were in the insurance industry, cell phone industry, construction, that want to do that and are looking for an energetic, young, rising star winemaker to do that for them. That can be fraught with peril. And I think this would apply to any kind of entrepreneurial enterprise. I've seen the downside of that from a lot of people in this particular industry. People can get bored. People can get frustrated with the returns, particularly in this industry. The returns are not very good. I'll say that. You have to bring a lot of passion to it. it wasn't what it was cracked up to be, or they decide they sort of know it all and want to put their own brand on it. And in any kind of a partnership like that, the guy with the money always has a lot of power and a lot of leverage, and it's pretty easy to force someone out if you want to force them out. You can make a capital call, and well, everybody, we're looking for $1 million, so your 30% share is $300,000. Pony up. You got $300,000? Maybe not. So this happens. Frankly, a lot of people are pretty strong personalities, and what's a politically correct term for dicks? They're out there. I've seen that several times. People are just very, very difficult to work for. So it can be a real challenge, and if you, it's one thing to work for them, but it's another thing to go into partnership with them. But those are all possibilities. Going to the bank is certainly challenging, and this applies, I think, to any startup industry. What is your experience? What's your product? How are you going to make a difference? Which how are you going to sell this thing? Which gets you into sort of the next of a number of kind of fundamental questions. What's the price point of your product really going to be? Which this feeds into a whole lot of things. You're not going to make a value wine and make a 99-point wine using the finest fruit and the most labor-intensive techniques in the world. And that's a really tough question for us. I looked at this question, and it became apparent to me. I mean, I'm an engineer, so the first thing I did was get out my Excel and start building spreadsheets. I'm sure a lot of you guys can probably relate to that. You're probably numbers people. And this is an engineering background is really useful in building a business. There's a lot of applicable skills, and I'm really actually jealous of a lot of the skills you guys are attaining, because I really wish I had the grounding and the grounding in accounting and economics that you all have. And I think you're going to find that's something that is going to help you in just a wide variety of businesses, and it could certainly help you in a business like this. So the first thing came pretty apparent just looking at the numbers is that retail is just key. Direct to consumer is just key in something like this because of the margins. So we looked at where our winery was located and figured correctly that we were going to sell a lot of wine out the door to tourists and locals, and that was going to be a big part of our bottom line. One of someone I heard speak on this topic years ago said that you can take the percentage of wine you sell at retail, and that's going to be the percentage of your bottom line that represents, so that income represents, and it's hugely important. So we looked at this puzzle and thought, well, we're in Winthrop, okay, we're not in Walla Walla, we're not in Woodinville, we're not in Seattle, and people probably aren't going to be willing to pay Walla Walla prices for wine that's coming from Winthrop. And I think that was exactly correct. I think I got that one right. And what's interesting about that is that a lot of our fruit comes from Walla Walla. Our barrels come from France, just like everybody else's. So a lot of the inputs are really the same, but there is a perception and there's a location, and it can be as simple as saying, well, it's a nice wine, but I'm in Winthrop, I'm not in Walla Walla, I'm not in Woodinville, so I'm not paying that. So we realized that we had to kind of value price our wines, and what that dictated to us is that the wholesale portion of our wine was probably going to have to be directly distributed. Let me explain what I mean there. This is another question that comes up. How are you going to sell your wine? Are you going to use a distributor at 50 cents on the dollar, 49 cents on the dollar? Are you going to self-distribute to wholesale at 70 cents on the dollar? Maybe you're going to sell everything direct to consumer. There are a number of people that are out there doing that. They build huge wine clubs. They have no real retail presence outside of their own shop. They have no presence in the marketplace. So this is another question that again feeds back into price point. What obviously if you're going to get 50 cents on the dollar, your input cost is going to have to be a lot lower, or your retail price is going to have to be a lot higher. And can you command that retail price? Gets you to the question of how do you really want to, what is your brand vision? What do you want that to be? Who do you want to sell your wine to? I mean, do you want to sell it to rich billionaires? Do you want to sell it to, if you could? And I know people that really want to do that. I'd love to have a 100-point wine and sell it for $100 a bottle, and nobody can get it. It's not my thing. And I've had this conversation with people who've had a couple of really good ratings, kind of became the darling of a reviewer, and all of a sudden their wine was really sought after. It's like, well, everybody's telling me I should raise my price. And I'm like, well, who's your customer? Who's your typical customer? Well, they're friends of mine. I've come to know them and like them. It's like, do you want to exchange them for software billionaires? I didn't. He didn't either. So this is a real consideration. What do you want your vision to be? Do you want to have to convince somebody that this is a $100 bottle of wine when it has the same inputs as a $30 bottle of wine? The most apt, I think, metaphor for this was a vineyard manager that I really like, who I won't tell you the circumstances, but he basically threw out, he said, there's so much BS in this industry that we should all be making compost instead of wine and we'd be better off. And it's true. There is just an awful lot of sizzle to go along with the steak in this industry. There's a lot of cachet. And that, I would argue, is most of the difference between a $100 wine and a $30 wine. And I think you guys have been to Bookwalter Winery, right? And John Bookwalter, there's an example of somebody who's putting a lot of stake into the equation there. He's doing some really over-the-top things in the vineyard. But John is using many of the same barrels I'm using, Taranto and Sylvain barrels. These are $1,000 a barrel. You can only, you put 100% new French oak on a bottle of wine. Well, a barrel of wine holds, 25 cases, 300 bottles of wine. So you've got maybe, even if you wanted to over oak the wine, you've got $3.50. These are top quality barrels. You can't really get any better. So how can you really pump that input higher? You can pay more for the fruit. As I said, John's doing some pretty over-the-top things. In theory, are pretty interesting, and he's spending a lot of money on it to do that. But so you take, here's an example of inputs. What does that really do to the price of the wine? Does that get you from a $30 bottle of wine to a $100 bottle of wine? Well, Rajiv and I met at a vineyard tasting for a vineyard called Connerly Vineyard. Pretty atmospherically priced vineyard. This is right up there with the vineyards in Red Mountain, which is a small growing region in the state. Their costs are, and pretty much everyone in the boutique winery regime is doing what we do, which is they're not buying fruit on the spot market. They're not going out to growers and saying, how much do you want for a ton of your fruit? Well, the fruit really isn't available on the spot market. It's available by long-term contracts that are by the acreage contracts. So you go in and you secure a contract with somebody for an acre or acres of ground in various blocks of the vineyard, and you tell them how you want to farm it. They will, within reason, work with you. They're not going to want to dilute the quality of their vineyard because their reputation is tied in with it as well. And so you have a range of, obviously, acreage prices. Connor is probably at the top end of that range. It may be $9,000, now $9,500 an acre on some of their fruit. That's pretty much top tier in Washington. And it's a cool vineyard, so you can't really put a lot of fruit on the vines there and expect to ripen them. So you can figure on, in a typical red variety, maybe 3 tons of fruit to the acre. So you're at $3,000 to $3,200, $3,300 a ton in fruit. Okay, a ton of fruit is going to, everybody got their calculator out? A ton of fruit is going to yield you about maybe 2.5 barrels of finished wine. what we would call free run wine, kind of front, what is not pressed very very hard out of the the vines. Let's say when you finish topping the barrels, you're left with a couple of barrels, so 600 bottles of wine. You're at $5 a bottle in fruit costs, $5.50 perhaps. So along comes John Bookwalter, and he says, well, I've got this consultant from France, which first of all is costing him money. These guys don't come cheap. And he's on the cutting edge of what they're trying to do. Sometimes you wonder, but they're sought after. And he's suggesting that it's important. Did John go over this with you guys about the sap temperature in the vines and how he wants to get the clusters closer to the vines? So once the grapes have sort of attained their size, this isn't something you want to do too early. He goes in and massively thins down the vines, so he's taking half to 2/3 of the fruit off the vines and getting those clusters much closer to the cordon. Similar effect to what someone would do, and Rajiv was asking me, what do the people in the Grand Crus of France do in Bordeaux and in Chateau Latour, Chateau Lafite? They've got a whole bunch more vines. So they've got vines that are this far apart and just have a couple of clusters of fruit on each vine. So you're essentially creating a facsimile of that by spacing these clusters much closer. So let's say he cuts half the fruit off of the vine. You've gone from $5 to $10, a bottle in grape juice cost there. That's not a small thing by any means. And $5 a bottle is extremely expensive as it is. But does that get you from a $30 wine to a $100 wine? No, but it's cool, and it's something to talk about, and it's at least something that's material that you can say that you're doing different. And it's quite frankly a lot more, in my opinion, than most people are doing that have that kind of a divergence in price. So really, a lot of that price point is scarcity and perception rather than fruit cost. But fruit cost is really important. And when I talk about price point, there's what people are willing to pay, and as I said, people are willing to pay less in Winthrop than they're willing to pay in Walla Walla, just as a rule. But the question of what people want to pay is really different, and this is something that's surprising to me. But and I kind of shared at lunch here, an anecdote about the people that drive me absolutely nuts. These are people that are, my age or older, 55, 60 years old, 65 years old, that are, say, an attorney that's making $250,000 a year, has been drinking wine for 40 years, knows good wine, understands the difference between good wine and poor wine. This should be your core customer. It's willing to pay a good dollar for wine, right? What do they go nuts about? You put your cheapest kitchen sink red table wine on sale for $12. This is what we really need, is a $12 bottle of table wine, one that I would go broke trying to make, right? It just makes you tear your hair out, These are the people who should be able to pay you a fair price for a bottle of wine, but that's what they want to pay. People will, the magic price point, as far as I'm concerned right now, is about $19.99 for reds and $14.99 for whites. We can barely make wine for that profitably. You can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. So again, you get it when you're looking at what your price point is going to be. You have to look at your inputs. The reverse is possible. You can make a sow's ear out of a silk purse. You can take very good fruit, and if you don't execute, it doesn't work. But you can. People who recognize good quality in wine will recognize that there is a difference between $3,000 a ton fruit or $2,500 a ton fruit and $800 or $1,000 a ton for fruit. The same is true at the vineyard level as is true in the winery level. There's a lot less inputs. Typically, they're labor inputs in a vineyard. Are you hand pruning or are you machine pruning the vines? Are you hand thinning or are you machine thinning? Are you going through and making another pass to strip out the leaves and get more light into the canopy, which has direct effects on the flavor profile of the grapes? Are you shoot positioning in August? Each one of those passes is going to cost you a lot of money, several $100s every time you send a crew through the vineyard to do that by hand. Can you do a reasonable facsimile of that with machines, cheaper? Now, things are improving in mechanical, mechanical harvesting and thinning and leaf stripping and that sort of thing. But they're really, the gold standard is still not even close. I mean, hand labor is still where it's at in terms of quality. Are you dropping fruit at veraison, reducing the yield? Veraison is when the grapes color up and start to sweeten, and August when you can see the uniformity of the vineyard. Uniformity is kind of the gold standard of what you're trying to achieve. So you want to drop that fruit that doesn't look even when you get that visual cue as to, when all the grapes start to turn purple and some are still green, you want to get rid of those. When everything's uniformly purple and some are mottled, you want to get rid of those. And then you want to look at structures, are the grapes nested? Well, all of that stuff reduces your potential yield. All of that stuff takes labor to do, and it increases the price of the fruit. And it makes a difference to people that are discerning consumers. You don't have to be a wine snob to recognize the difference. I mean, I'll take a bottle of my wine and bring it to a party and put it on the shelf next to I better not, almost said disparaged a Washington wine there. Let's say a Gallo, or Woodbridge or something. A $10 bottle of wine and a $25 bottle of wine that's really should be a $30 bottle of wine. Guess which one's going to get drunk first? Whether someone's going to pay you another $15 for the bottle is a completely different question. But even an average consumer can tell the difference between a good bottle of wine and a poor bottle of wine. And inputs have are important. French oak versus American oak. You can buy really cheap whiskey barrels out of American oak for a few $100s a copy. Good quality American oak barrels are probably 50 to 60% of the cost of good quality French oak barrels. It's a huge difference. So if you've got, you could have a couple of dollars, a bottle, and in oak cost. If you've got a Cabernet Sauvignon with 60% new barrels in a vintage, and you can kind of, if you guys are doing pro formas on this thing, you can use those sort of figures. Figure $1,000 or $1,100 for a high quality French oak barrel and $600 for an American oak barrel. 300 bottles, and then multiply by the fraction of new wood that you want in the wine. And I would argue that 100% is never the right answer, and sometimes less can be more. I make wines that I don't put any new oak on at all, and I wouldn't think of changing that. So oak is a really important input. Here's something that you guys would never make this mistake, I'm sure. But I did. It was a doozy. This is the biggest mistake I made in putting my business plan together. One year, my accountant told me when we were still getting our butts kicked that congratulations, you made money last year. I just what? And the next year, my son, who doesn't have a lot of the passive losses I have from real estate, had a whopping tax bill. And talking to his accountant, I'm saying, well, why is this? He said, well, you made all this money at the winery. It's like, made all this money at the winery? I wrote a $60,000 check to the winery last year. What are you talking about? Well, anybody want to guess what I was forgetting here? Okay, costs of goods sold are not expenses. Okay, so here I'm looking at what I'm paying out, and really what my accountant's telling me is, no, you're buying equity. You're buying inventory. And that was a shock, it was a real shock, and it kind of hits you where you live. Like I said, I hope none of you make that mistake, or you're not getting your money's worth and this is a real advantage you'll have in a lot of businesses you go into. But I'd never been in a manufacturing business before, and that really took me by surprise. So here's another thing to really consider, and this is something that I got half of right and didn't get the other half of. I kind of realized that when you look at the difference between a white wine and a red wine, and the first thing to tell your hypothetical winemaker is make more white wines out of the chute. They are much quicker to market. But when you make a red wine, here's a typical wine. It comes in October. Stays in barrel and for a year, is blended slightly less than a year, stays in barrel a few more months beyond that, so you're maybe 14 or 15 months in barrel till you bottle it. I really like to see at least a year of bottle age on all, of my red wines before I sell them. It makes a huge difference in quality. It just, the vines get shocked with oxygen when they go into the bottle. We call it bottling shock. And they just really relax over a certain period of time and they just become much more friendly, much softer, much rounder, much more appealing. We see this in the barrel, but because of the small volume in a bottle, it's much more noticeable. But when we decant our barrels, we see the same thing. You decant a barrel, and all of a sudden, the first time I did this with barrels at home, it's like, wow, this is wonderful, it's delicious. You've just decanted the wine, tastes soft and round, and I'd tell a friend to come over, and 3 days later, you'd open the thing up, and it tastes metallic and tight and bitter and hard, and it's just gone into this shocked phase. And then over about 2 or 3 months, it sort of relaxes and gets back into balance again, and then you rack it, it becomes big and voluminous and lush and elegant, and it goes back into that shock again, and those cycles slowly soften out and get the sine wave gets a little less deep. But you see the same feature in bottling, and so I like to keep them in bottle for a year. A lot of inventory costs there. And I realized that when you're doing this, you're basically putting a brick of cash in a safe, right? What I didn't realize was how much rent I was going to have to pay on the safe. You need a facility to put this in. You know, you've got the capital cost of the facility, you've got utility costs. Where we live, it's pretty hot in the summer, and you know, we spend a lot of money on electricity. You know, cooling that facility in the summer, keeping it warm in the winter is not as big a problem, but it's an issue. And the upside of that is wine doesn't tend to go bad. Wine tends to appreciate over time. It might not make you any money unless you're increasing the cost of what you're charging for the wine, like in a library program. Each year you're increasing it by an appropriate return, and selling it as a curiosity item or just as an interesting item. And I gave Rajiv a bottle of my 2004 Merlot that is just, it's extraordinary right now. It's drinking just absolutely beautifully after a number of years in the cellar. But the upside is that if you're making beer is perishable. So these people are actually going out to stores and pulling product off the shelf. Well, that's not a problem we really realistically face. So there is an upside there, but there is a real cost to keeping that inventory. Again, packaging. What's your what's your label going to look like? How are you going to what is the reflection of your brand? Is it you want goofy, and do you want it to look cheap? People go that route. Do you want it to be like big here? Charles Smith, prominent winemaker from Walla Walla, that is just kind of a marketing genius. He's got Kung Fu Girl Riesling, kind of a goofy and kind of cutting edge. I don't know what he's looking for. A younger, edgier crowd, I guess. 125,000 cases a year of Kung Fu Girl Riesling. Just hit that one out of the park. So what's your market? What's your is your packaging going to be commensurate with that? And what is your packaging going to cost you? Are you going to put the wine in a naturally corked bottle? Well, a natural cork, good quality, number one Portuguese cork, 43 cents a piece. It's a substantial part of the price of the bottle. We pay about 65 to 75 cents a bottle for our bottles. Curiously, the Flint bottles that tend to go in some of the cheaper wines, that lower priced wines we have, the white wines are more expensive because they can't use as much post-consumer product. You can only make a clear bottle once. 70, 75 cents maybe for a bottle, plus not insignificant shipping charges. You cannot even fill a 54-foot trailer with empty glass bottles. It's just too heavy. Glass is about half the weight of the finished product. So what kind of a bottle do you want? I mean, you can go over the top with that, and if you're trying to sell impress someone with a $100 bottle of wine, you very well may want something really special. I noticed in a trade magazine the other day, the Figgins is the Leonetti and the Figgins label. one of the kind of early successes in Washington wine, really sought after wines, have gone to a glass company and had a custom bottle made with an embossed seal on it. I don't know what that costs, but I guarantee you it's not cheap. You have to have an actual run of production of your own bottles, and if they make more than you need, they're going to have to warehouse it for you. There's going to be huge costs with that, so I can't imagine what something like that costs. The capsules that go on the top, you could use PVC or you can use tin. Well, tin has gone from about 15 cents when we started to about 30 cents now. A good quality label can easily run you between, depending on the run size, can run you between 20 and 30 cents or so. If you have a smaller production run, if you want to do a label, you have to take that into account. And a lot of people like small, difficult to get, lots of vineyard select runs of labels. Well, the labeling company is going to charge you $120 for a printing plate for the changeable information, $250 setup fee. So if you've got a few hundred labels, that gets expensive. It can add 50% or more to the price of your label. So you could go from a 20-cent label on a 500 or 600 case run of Cabernet Sauvignon to 45 cents on a 75 case run of Reserve Semillon, something like that. All of those inputs are going to be important, and kind of perversely, bottle size, consumers really like big, heavy, massive bottles. They reach for them. They're sensual. They feel good in your hand. They look massive and substantial. You put a big, massive bottle on the shelf next to a wimpy, lean bottle. There's a real perception there to fight. But it's something we really wrestle with, because one of those is much greener than the other one. I mean, you can have bottles that are 3 times, 2 to 2.5 times as heavy as another bottle. That's your carbon footprint. 65% of our carbon footprint's in the wine. So can you sell that? Can you explain to people that this lean, mean bottle is you're doing your part for the environment, because that big juicy bottle with the punt, the cavity in the bottom that you could just about put your fist into and it would disappear is big heavy walls on it is an environmental disaster, really. But it's there's a perception there. So and I'd kind of end with I'd like to give you guys some time for some questions. But as a friend of mine recently said, you can train a monkey to make wine. A lot of people can take good fruit and make good wine at least once or twice. The question is, can they be consistent with it? Can you have good quality control? And can you sell it? I mean, selling wine is hard. It's really hard. And selling it for a good price is really tough. And you can't, if you want to, you're not going to be able to lean on, at our size, we can't lean on suppliers of bottles and corks at all. And it's really tough to go to a vineyard owner who's charging you $1,200 or $1,300 a ton for fruit when he knows you're paying, $3,300 to Connor Lee Vineyard, and say, well, I really would like to put this in a red table wine that I want to sell for $15 or $16. Gee, can you give me a better price on the grapes? Well, the reality of that is that his fruit is costing you $1.50 a bottle. And I mean, I don't even, it's hard for me to even have the guts to tell somebody they're charging too much for their fruit when he's facing all the same problems I am. But it's a tough business. The margins are not really there, and it takes a lot of passion. So anyway, can I answer any questions you guys have?
Thank you, John. That was hugely instructive, and for the numbers geeks here, we got a trove of information. I'll moderate traffic, but please start obviously down to moderating questions. John?
Yeah.
So how do you differentiate your wine? You're saying that it's difficult to sell wine to all the people. What's your value proposition to sell wine?
What's special about our wine? We really have from the outset leveraged our place, the Methow Valley, and it's interesting because it's not really a grape growing region, but how many of you have heard of the Methow Valley? A few, yeah. It's a real popular place in Washington. It's a real special place. It's a beautiful place. A lot of people in Seattle have second homes there. We call them kind of our wine evangelists. And it's not just our wine. It's it's Sunny Pine Farms goat cheese. It's Crown S Ranch meat. It's people that are making soap, or they're making handcrafts in the Methow Valley. And in fact, recently there's been a brand developed called Made in the Methow that's kind of tied into this. It's like, well, we could have told you guys this a long time ago. We really connect our wines to the community through some charitable work and locally themed labels and that sort of thing. What we've tried to, and this kind of goes back to where we wanted to be. Our customers are our friends, or have become our friends. Are some of our best friends now after many years. We want to make wine that's affordable to them, and so we are trying to brand value and kind of honest pricing, good, quality and price point and value pricing. So we're trying to give you a $30 bottle of wine in a $25 package, and a lot of times people get it and appreciate it, and sometimes people can't tell whether you're trying to masquerade at what should be a $15 wine as a $25 bottle of wine, or doing what we're doing, which is kind of discounting. But again, we kind of got forced into that by virtue of where we're trying to sell the bulk of our wine at retail. But it does pay off, but it's a tough nut. So value and connection to the community really in place is sort of where we're focused. Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
What is your bestseller, and do you have different bestsellers per channel, like Wine Club or Tasting Rooms?
Mm-hmm. Our bestseller is Pinot Gris. It probably won't surprise you to hear that it's one of our least expensive wines. Our second bestseller is our red table wine that we call Community Red. The name is, we kind of hit on that after our place almost burned down in a forest fire, and people just came out of the woodwork to help us. And we take 5% of our gross, which doesn't seem like, well, you guys probably realize how important 5% of a gross price is, and return that to nonprofits in the Methow Valley. We sell a ton of that. And again, that's also a $15 price point wine. It's kind of it used to be a salvaged product. It was press fraction what we squeezed out of the skins. And some wines that we declassified. This is a nice wine, but it doesn't have the black currant that we're looking for in our Cabernet. This will be a great component in the Community Red. It's a kitchen sink wine, varies every year. We're actually making so much of it that we're having to go out and source fruit directly for that. And that's kind of fun, actually, trying to go out, and I am buying fruit on the spot market for wines like that. People will tell me that they're long on Cabernet Franc or Merlot, and I go, I like this site, I like the grower. Can you crop that down a little bit? Can you open it up a little bit for the next month? And what kind of a price can you give me that for? And we'll see if we can't make that work in as something you can actually go out and source for that wine. So the lower price point wines are definitely our best sellers. That sort of trumps everything else. And right now we're selling a lot of wine in growlers, which is, somebody was asking about marketing a minute ago. Marketing green and growlers is huge, and consumers are all over them. They love they get the fact that they're green. As I said, 65% of our carbon footprint, that includes vineyard operations for an integrated winery. There's a lot of carbon sinking in the vineyards as well, but that's not green paint. That's if you want to be meaningfully green, that's where the meat is in carbon footprint, is in the glass. So we take, what growlers are? These are like refillable consumer-owned containers. But it's been hard. Our lobbying organization that I'm on the board of just passed a law to allow this in secondary tasting rooms. We tried to get this extended to wine shops and grocery stores and restaurants, and weren't successful with that. You can buy beer in those places, but that's a huge and growing market sector. And we can pass on the cost of the packaging because they're buying the packaging. We generally sell the packaging just about at cost to encourage that. But it looks like quite a deal when you take out that $1.50 on a, $1.50 a bottle on a 750 ml, basis and apply that to a liter. So you can take out, probably a couple bucks on the relatively price it a couple bucks cheaper for a liter of wine than it would otherwise be. And it's very attractive, and it's green, and it doesn't cost you a thing. And also the real advantage of that, the problem we run into in our red blends, which is what everybody wants, we've developed another blend that we call Western Red that we just sell on the west side of the state. We can only make enough of the community red to sell in the community in the Methow Valley, and we'll have people that that buy all of our wines and buy our highest end wines. And you almost use the Western Red as a teaser to get them to buy your other wines because they want a wine that they can sell for a nice red blend they can sell for 18 or 19 bucks. And it's not easy to make that profitably when you're selling that, at 70% of wholesale plus through an agent at 15% of that wholesale price that you're bringing in, and you're just getting down to where you're almost trading currencies. If you can sell more of that at retail, you're really doing well. And that's the wonderful thing about the growlers is we're taking that same juice that would sell out, like that at wholesale. We'll release our community red in Memorial Day, and it's gone by Labor Day pretty much, except what we reserve for the restaurants. And instead of doing that, we're putting more of it into kegs, and we're bringing people into the winery and buying it at a not typically full retail because, first of all, we're discounting it a little bit above and beyond the price of the packaging. But a lot of those people are wine club customers, and we give them typically we give them discounts on wine. So the typical buyer would be 1 or 2 bottles. That's a 10% discount for them as well. But it's well above wholesale in any case, and it's bringing people into the winery where maybe they're going to buy something else. If nothing else, they're going to taste your product. So we have a lot of people that we asked, how come we haven't seen you in a while? Well, every time I come in here, you offer me a taste of wine, and I feel like a freeloader. That's something you didn't really expect. That you're thinking you're doing something positive there, and actually you're kind of scaring people off with large S. But yes, sir.
I have a couple of questions. First one is, how many cases do you sell in a year?
In a year? We're right size now, so we're pretty much selling our annual production from a year or so ago. Our reds have been stable for some time, although our blends are growing. 4,500 roughly. We're for a long time we were sort of betting on the come a little bit. We were thinking, our sales are increasing, so we need to be, you're 2.5 or more years out on a red wine, so you really got to guess in a lot of cases. And guess what we did wrong? We ended up with a lot of inventory when the wheels sort of fell off, we fixed that by repackaging a lot of that wine as that was the initiation of a lot of these brands. And you get, somebody will come in and you've got a run of wine that was Merlot from a particular vintage that is 60% Merlot from Connerly Vineyard at $9,500 an acre, crops at 3 tons to the acre, and they go, "That's a nice $19 Merlot you got there." It's like, yeah, you think, So we were able to push out a lot of juice in a burning inventory, but you're monetizing a lot of inventory when you can really use it, and you're reducing your inventory your storage costs and kind of right sizing your getting yourselves back to more a run of the vintage sort of production to sales ratio. And right now I think we're in kind of a sweet spot where we are pretty much right-sized and growing on our mainline wines like our Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, Merlot. Syrah's a little bit of an outlier. Syrah's tough to sell these days. Merlot, our Cedar Rosa blend of Cabernet Franc and Merlot, and our Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, and our lower cost red blends are just there's just we cannot begin to keep up with demand on those wines. So as we increase production, our sales are increasing on those wines. We're actually building a new facility right now because we're sort of too blocked in a number of areas. And this is something that, you get into, how do you size your facility appropriately, and how do you make adjustments as you go forward on that? And we're blocked by our blending tank size, and we're having to do some really creative kind of mad scientists pouring back and forth between tanks to try and get a homogeneous blend of Pinot Gris. We are too blocked in our what we call our finishing cellar, which is when the reds come out of fermentation. Where do you keep them warm as they finish fermentation? And we're too blocked in our barrel cellar as well. We don't have a lot of room in fermentation capacity either. So we're building a new facility and going to shuffle things around to keep all the space we have and use some more.
Do you ever? I mean, you probably don't do it, but are there wineries that age wine in steel tanks?
There are, and that can actually be a fine thing to do. I'm seeing more people doing what they call cooling wines down, where they'll take them out of barrel and put them in steel. Steel has one really strong signature, and that is that it is very anaerobic, and there is a real reductive. There is a real swing of style from in the spectrum from oxidative to reductive. It really, good, bad, or indifferent, it really affects the style of the wine. Syrah is really notable for that. Another wine that is Sauvignon Blanc. A lot of these cool climate, New Zealandy grapefruit and, not grapefruit, gooseberry and grass and hay and these vegetal characters, a lot of those are accentuated by protecting the wine from oxygen. Syrah, you can make the same lot of wine from a meaty, gamey, smoky, gunpowder smelling, chocolatey kind of thing into a bright blueberry and black pepper thing by oxidizing it. Steel is hermetic. It is very reductive, and you can enhance that character in wine, and it can really very versatile stylistic tool. It's also cheap as cooperage, so you can recycle your wood cooperage. I mean, stainless is not cheap, but it's forever, and it's on a gallonage basis, it's not nearly as expensive as oak.
So do they age it first in barrels and then they take it out?
Some do, some don't. You hear a lot of talk about naked wines, Chardonnay, Sauvignon, a lot of white wines that traditionally were made in oak, Viognier, that never see oak. It adds a hard edge to the wine. This is a long topic here, but wines that have phenolics in them, Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, tannins and things like that, those can be oxidized, which goes hand in hand with barrel fermentation. There's a little bit we were talking about the angel share, and I think this is something that Rajib wanted you to take into account, is how much wine you lose to evaporation. Makes record keeping pretty interesting. But we lose about a bottle per barrel per month. 225 liter barrel, you can lose three quarters of a liter to a liter per month just through evaporation. That's in a humidified cellar. But so you replace that by topping the wine. You introduce a little bit of oxygen when you do that. Tanks are very tall, so there's also settling that goes on there for sort of Brownian motion, very, very slow settling process. Well, a barrel's this big around, your settling distance is like this. You can get fine sediments to settle out in a couple of months in that space, and then you can decant them, clarify the wines, remove them from the settled solids. In a tank that's 10, 15, 20 feet tall, it's going to obviously take a lot longer. You might have to do that desedimentation by filtering. But the other thing that barrels do, the oak will actually polymerize with some of those tannins and take the edge off of the wine. The oxygen will also oxidize and form polymers in some of those wines that make them bigger chain molecules that are softer on the palate. So there's a lot of, do you want that edginess in the wine? Maybe you do. Steel can help with that. Do you want to soften it? Barrels are probably going to be more effective. You can do micro-oxidation in tanks and put oak staves in there, and I'm not generally impressed by the results of that, but it's possible. If you're making a wine you're trying to sell for $10 a bottle that a wholesaler is going to pay you $4.99 for. I mean, I couldn't bottle. Not only could I not bottle water for that, I couldn't bottle air for that. Our distributed overhead's about $5 a bottle. So when you're getting into lower price point wines, you often don't have a choice. You can't put them in French oak barrels if you wanted to.
Just a couple of short questions.
Sure.
Riesling, how long does it take for that to come out? If you're starting to make, and you said the first year make white and Riesling.
Well, let's say I don't make Riesling, but Riesling can vary a lot, but it can be quite similar as well. So our Pinot Gris, for example, we bottled our Pinot Gris in January this year. You can preserve a lot of the fruity, and we're looking for a fruity crisp, so we harvest the fruit a little earlier, brighter acid. I'm looking for a very bright acid wine. I leave a touch of residual sugar in the wine by chilling the. First of all, we ferment them cool in stainless steel tanks with jackets on them and chill them. So it takes a long time to ferment, maybe a month and a half to 2 months to finish fermentation. When they get down to just a scotch of residual sugar, we crash the fermentation by dropping the temperature down to about 30 degrees. Clarify the wines in a few weeks, stabilize them. There's no reason in a wine like that not to bottle it. So you could potentially be selling that. We've actually released our 2013 Pinot Gris, showing really nicely. And it'll be probably realistically sold out before harvest is over. And I wish we had another 500 cases of it. Frankly, we're not pushing it that hard. Yes, sir.
Just a quick question. So when you do a white versus a red wine,
Mm-hmm.
can you use the same pressing and all the machines that you use for the manufacturing part up to the holding tanks, or do you have separate machines because the cost of cleaning it outweighs?
No, cost of cleaning is something we do every day in crush. You really have to be concerned about bacterial spoilage, bacteria and yeast that from the air that do bad things. That's a good question. Crush equipment is it's really tough to justify investments in crush equipment because you use them so infrequently in the winery, and people are willing to sell you all kinds of cool stuff that are going to make all these wonderful differences. So typically the difference between a red and a white is that you crush. Actually, crushing is a misnomer. We typically destem grapes. You get plenty of damage to the grapes to allow the yeast into the grapes, and by actually grinding them or crushing them, you get a lot of bitter phenolics released from the skins of the grapes. So typically we destem the grapes. The whites usually can often go right to the press. Chardonnay, Semillon, certain varieties we just whole cluster press. We put them right in the press and squeeze them. We use a bladder press. That's a kind of like a sausage-shaped thing with a bladder on one side and slots on the other. Some people use basket presses. We pretty much, typically you squeeze the white grapes pretty much right away. The exception would be Sauvignon. We give it a little bit of skin contact to pick up some of those flavors that people expect, maybe 12 hours. Rosé, we'd leave on the skins. We destem the grapes, leave them on the skins for 12 to 24 hours to pick up a little bit of color. Reds, you destem the grapes into fermenter. We use open-top bins, and they stay on the skins for 9 to 14 days typically as they ferment. That's where the color comes out of the skins. And some quote-unquote white grapes, actually, Pinot Gris is almost as darkly colored as Pinot Noir in some years. So it would definitely make a pink to red wine if you left it on the skins. So it is crushed early. Use the same press. You can use the same tankage. Depending on where you were. If you were in California and you had a warm site and a cool site, you might easily use a white wine fermenter. Then take the wine and put it in a storage tank, or I suppose you could possibly even bottle it in time to get a late harvested red into that fermenter. We use different fermenters for sure, but we use the same destemmer for all of our stuff, and we use the same press for all of our.
Just one last question, Dad. Does yeast matter? Do you guys have a specific type of yeast that you like to use every year? I know that's a huge thing.
All these easy questions. I say not only yes, but hell yes. There's a lot of debate about that, and I don't think anybody really has the answer. There have been some just absolutely mind-bending studies that have come out recently about doing genetic fingerprinting about the yeast that's actually living in the grapes. People talk about native ferments, and these are especially the really high-priced winemakers, the indigenous fermentations. What we're finding is that if you have a winery that's been around any length of time, probably what is fermented. They did a study up in BC, and they found these people were using 20 or 30 different, very expensive commercial yeasts, and that there were only 3 yeasts that were finishing the fermentations in any of those fermentations. One of them is typically going to be PDM, Prix de Mousse, very aggressive strain of yeast, and whether you have a unique strain of that, because there is some genetic drift in yeast, so whether you have a unique strain of feral yeast, that's debatable, but pretty much when you hear people talk about native ferments, what they've got is feral ferments, feral strains of commercial yeast. Interesting question, though.
We got a question.
Oh, yeah.
We go back to you, Jason.
Yeah, sorry. Yes.
So I have a question. So you say you focus on the retail stuff for the channel distribution and retail stuff.
Yeah.
And also you do something for exclusively for the wine clubs and also some maybe rich customer. So, but you said that most of the winery maybe store they focus on retailing. Like maybe if you want to know the revenue, you just say how much they put on the retail. So why don't you sell those products to exclusive to maybe some attorneys and some high income levels people?
Why don't I try to target them? Or, as I said, I want to sell wine to my friends. Or actually, a lot of my customers have kind of become my friends. And I got to be honest with you, wine snobs leave me kind of cold. So it's a little schizophrenic. I want to have my wine in their cellars because it increases the reputation of your winery. Sort of the same way that we have chosen to have a presence in the marketplace and sell some of our wines that we could easily sell out at retail and make more margin on. We want to hold some of that back for restaurants because you almost can't buy that kind of marketing. If you can get your wine in some high-end restaurants, that's something you should almost be giving it away. And this is, did that answer your question?
Yeah. One more thing is like you said about the red wine, you have to keep it for at least 1 year before you sell it. So what are you going to sell during this year? If you will store like all the red wine you produce this year, you want to maybe put them into the warehouse wait for 1 year then sell it. So what are you going to sell for this year?
We're selling, we just are releasing, typically we're in 2011 reds, now 2010s and 2011s, vintage wines in our reds. We are about to release our first 2012 red. That will be a Merlot that went into bottle in probably 2012. It would have gone into bottle in maybe December of 2013. So in another few months here, it's really premature. So we're trying to hold back a little bit, but it's our earliest to bottle wines are typically bottled about a year from vintage. So it's going to be a couple of years from vintage before we sell the wine. And again, it's just it's stylistic. You can push them out quicker if you want to and if you really have demand, but I think you're really kicking yourself in the cojones to do that because it's not going to show as well, and the additional inventory cost of holding it for that few months is really going to be visible in quality.
Perhaps we can continue this discussion afterwards because other people also have to go. So I'm going to let Jason have the privilege of asking the last question, and then I have 2 questions that relate to something that everybody might be interested in.
Okay.
So I'm going to...
This is relating to labels, and I think I read that for varietals, you have to have at least 75% of whatever it is the variety is.
Generally speaking, in some states, Oregon, it's 90%.
Okay, so that implies that remaining 25% can be whatever. But okay, so how common is it then for it to just be 100% Chardonnay or Cabernet Sauvignon? Or is it more common for people to add some complexity or to the flavor to add?
I would say it's rare in Cabernet Sauvignon and very common in Chardonnay. I don't know anybody that blends. Some people will blend a little bit of Aligoté in Chardonnay. What's that?
I couldn't find a blend on Chardonnay.
Well, you don't have to tell anybody, so you don't have to say a word about it if you don't want to. But I will tell you that typically we'll disclose that. I think people in reds tend to favor blends, whether they they like the idea, I think, of a blend. It's very traditional in Bordeaux, where they don't label wines varietally. They label them as a Medoc or a Pauillac or a Saint-Estèphe, but that's a left bank wine, so that's predominated by Cabernet Sauvignon. It's probably going to contain a little Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, Malbec rarely. If you go to Saint-Emilion, it's going to be roughly 50-50 blend of Merlot and Cabernet Franc. But yeah, you don't have to say anything about it, but typically it really adds layers of dimension to add some of those other varieties to the wine. So I think it's very, very common to see significant sub-constituents in a Cab Sauv. It's pretty rare in a Chardonnay. Yeah.
Okay. So John, last few minutes, I like you.
Sure, and if anybody'd like to chat afterward, I'm happy to. I'll be stuck in traffic otherwise anyway, so.
Yeah, and we'd be happy to hang around, but because many people have other commitments.
Sure.
It's a Friday evening. I wanted you to.
You mean they have a life?
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So last few minutes, a little bit about the future. This is an industry, we talked about this a little bit at lunch. So this is an industry, I'm a newcomer, I know nothing about wine, I've just read fancy adjectives and a lot of sizzle. But there is also a science behind it, and one of the things that we learned from our visit, as well as from hearing you talk. Talk a little bit about what you see the future, especially with Washington being sort of a new wine growing region. It's now an $8 billion industry. It's coming up, it's noticeable. So as young winemakers in Washington, for example, what should these people be thinking about if they're going to launch their own winery? So I've given them some things like capping versus corking. You touched a little bit on that. Boxes versus bottling. You touched on the green aspect quite a lot. I understand that boxing technology is not very far along yet. Other things that you see, and also other opportunities, styles, or things that you see happening, or something as now an industry senior, you think the future of the industry in this state might do well to go in this direction? Some thoughts?
Yeah, boy, that's a big question. Finding a way to discern yourself. There were when my winery was bonded, we were bonded winery number 198 in Washington. That's really more larger number than there were wineries. Now people talk about 800 wineries. When we started, there were probably 150, and I'd say now there are probably 600. For example, our winery has 2 bonded wineries. Now within 3 months we'll have a third. We're still only one winery, so it's a little hard to get your head around what the real numbers are, but it gives you order of magnitude. There are roughly 4 times as many wineries now as there were 13 years ago when we started. It's a rapidly growing industry. 70% of the wine in the state is made by one winery. Let you guess which one? Right here in Woodinville. So it's a very top-heavy industry. 95% of the wine in the state is made by 5% of the wineries, and vice versa. So if you want to be one of those other, maybe 1,000, in not very many years, small brands, what are you going to do to distinguish yourself? Everybody wants to have that 95-point wine that you can sell for $100 a bottle, or a lot of people do. Green is really something I see coming on. I like the concept of boxed wines. Unfortunately, for some reason, the membranes on the packaging is not there. Theoretically, it sounds great because you're not introducing oxygen into it. I love kegged wines. We're starting to sell a lot of kegged wines for people with glass pour programs. First of all, we can make it attractive to them because we can eat the cost of packaging and we get the keg back, and they last forever. Essentially, they can be bought fairly cheap if they're surplus beer kegs or Coke syrup kegs, the Cornelius kegs that are being phased out. The wine is fresh. It's green. You can sell all of that. There's a young woman here in Woodinville, Diana at Piccola Cellars. That's their whole gig, is selling nothing but wine and kegs. That's certainly a way to do it. Screw caps versus corks, I'm not even going to get into that. The jury's still out. I think screw caps are a valid methodology. I don't think there's anything wrong with them. I don't think they particularly, it's a big trade-off. That's a whole separate debate. There's a lot of opportunities, and had time permitted, I told Rajiv I would give you kind of a SWOT analysis of the industry: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Climate change, obviously a big concern. How that affects water. Water is huge and going to be a really growing issue in ag. If we start losing our snowpack, that's how we store water in the state. In California, they store water in the coast mountains and reservoirs. Labor, how that ties into immigration policy is going to be a huge issue. Land, there's a lot of land out there in Washington that sort of on the edge, but I think a lot of the really great cool climate sites that could make some of the most exciting white wines in the world have not really been exploited yet. On the like the Quincy Plateau, the Beasley Hills, Chelan, places farther north that nobody is really, the foothills of the Blue Mountains, nobody's really growing fruit. The future of the reds, I think, is probably going to be in the Horseheaven Hills, where there just is land there. We're already the second largest grape producer in the country, but we're only 5% of the total. California is about 93% of the total, and everybody else is about 2% put together. So there's some real interesting economies of scale there. But yeah, the regulation is something I didn't get a chance to touch on, but boy, oh boy, was that a shock to see how badly regulated it is. It was my first real introduction to what I call American socialism, where the typical notion of socialism is that you have the government, for good, bad, or indifferent, trying to create regulations and laws that benefit consumers, or at least ostensibly, and the public at the expense of wealthy and corporations. And I think this is just one industry that you can see it in everything else, every other industry as well. But it's kind of turned on its head in this country, where government makes regulations to benefit corporations and the wealthy at the expense of consumers and the public. And the trouble with alcohol is that there's a public safety aspect, and there's also the artifact of the repeal of prohibition, the 21st Amendment, that gave states the right to regulate alcohol. And so they have the right to enact rules that a lot of states don't. And in the guise of public safety, they create rules that are really just blatantly designed to protect industry segments at the expense of others. And this industry is really owned by the distribution channels. And but you see it in the haves. It's the haves versus the have-nots now that Google and Apple, that were upcoming freewheeling supple businesses, are now the old guard. And they're trying to keep the little guys out and keep them down. And it's maybe more prominent in alcohol, because you can justify a lot of these things with the guise of public safety, kind of the fig leaf of public safety. But it's an interesting, and I think you're going to see that in whatever industry you go into. And I hear it from a lot of people, trucking and whatnot. It's the same thing. Regulation is not necessarily bad if you have the economy of scale to deal with it. If you're doing this stuff, compliance, or around your dinner table at night, mom and pop, it's one thing. If it's another partial full-time equivalent in an accounting department somewhere, it's a lot easier to deal with. So there's some of the biggest proponents of regulations are the biggest corporations, and we certainly see that in our industry.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate you coming.
Oh, it's my...